The cotton fields stretched endlessly under the brutal Mississippi sun, row upon row of white bolls waiting to be picked by hands that would never own what they harvested. The year was 1852, and Blackwood Plantation was known throughout 3 counties not for its prosperity, but for the iron fist with which it ruled over 200 souls who were considered nothing more than property in the eyes of the law. Eliza had learned long ago that survival required invisibility. She moved through the fields like a ghost, her calico dress faded to the color of dust, her head perpetually bowed as if the weight of the sky itself pressed down upon her shoulders. The other slaves barely noticed her anymore. She had perfected the art of becoming part of the landscape, just another tool among the hoes and cotton sacks. But those who knew how to look, who understood the language of the enslaved, could see something else entirely. A woman who watched everything, who forgot nothing, whose silence was not submission, but strategy. She had been at Blackwood for 7 years, though the exact date of her arrival had blurred into the monotonous brutality of plantation life. Before this, there had been another place, another master, and before that, though she rarely allowed herself to think of it, there had been a husband named Samuel and a daughter named Grace. Samuel had been sold south to Louisiana when Grace was only 2 years old. The child had been torn from Eliza's arms 3 years later, sold to a merchant from Charleston who needed a young girl to train as a house servant. Eliza had screamed that day, the last time anyone at her previous plantation heard her voice raised above a whisper. After that, silence became her armor, her weapon, her only remaining possession. At Blackwood, she existed in the margins. She picked her quota of cotton, never more and never less, careful not to stand out in either direction. She ate her rations of cornmeal and salt pork without complaint. She slept in the women's quarters, sharing a wooden pallet with 2 others, and kept her dreams locked so deep inside her chest that sometimes she wondered if they still existed at all. But there was one crack in her carefully constructed armor, one vulnerability she could not entirely eliminate: Isaiah. Isaiah was the plantation's blacksmith, a position that afforded him slightly more freedom of movement than the field hands. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered from years of working the forge, with hands that could shape iron but had never been allowed to shape his own destiny. Unlike Eliza, he had not been born into slavery. He had been a free man once, living in Philadelphia, working as an apprentice to a master blacksmith. But freedom for a black man in America was always conditional, always temporary. One night, walking home from a tavern, he had been seized by slave catchers who cared nothing for his papers, his protests, or his rights. Those concepts didn't exist for men with his skin color, not really. He had been sold south, and for 15 years had been the property of various masters before ending up at Blackwood. The connection between Eliza and Isaiah had formed slowly, almost imperceptibly, like water wearing down stone. It began with small acts of kindness that could be explained away as mere proximity. Isaiah would leave his water dipper near where Eliza worked when he passed by to repair equipment. She would position herself to provide shade for his workspace during the hottest part of the day. When the chain on her ankle cuff, a punishment for an infraction she hadn't committed, began to chafe her skin raw, Isaiah had filed down the rough edges when no one was watching, a repair that took only seconds but spoke volumes. They rarely spoke. Words were dangerous, witnesses were everywhere, and the punishment for any perceived relationship between slaves could range from savage beatings to permanent separation. But in the brief moments when their eyes met across the fields or in the quarters at night, entire conversations passed between them. Conversations about endurance, about remembering who they had been before chains, about maintaining some small core of humanity in a system designed to strip it away. Mr. Caldwell, the overseer, was a man who understood power only through the lens of violence. He was not the plantation owner. That was Mr. Blackwood himself, who rarely visited from his townhouse in Natchez. But Caldwell wielded authority like a cudgel. He was a compact man, built low and solid, with pale eyes that seemed to take pleasure in watching others suffer. He carried a whip always, coiled at his belt like a snake, and his horse was trained to rear and intimidate on command. Caldwell had a particular hatred for Eliza, though she had never given him direct cause. Perhaps it was her silence that enraged him, the way she absorbed his insults and threats without reaction, without the fear he craved. He interpreted her quietness as defiance, her lowered eyes as mockery. Several times he had engineered situations to break her, to force a response, but Eliza had survived by knowing exactly how much submission was required to avoid the worst punishments while maintaining the core of herself intact. The day everything changed began like any other. The summer sun rose merciless and white, turning the cotton fields into a shimmering hell by mid-morning. Eliza had been picking since dawn, her fingers moving with mechanical efficiency, dropping the white bowls into the sack that grew heavier with each row. The quota was 150 pounds per day for women, 200 for men. Fall short and face the lash. Exceed it too often and face a raised quota. The mathematics of slavery were designed to ensure there was no winning, only varying degrees of loss. By noon, Eliza's sack was nearly full, heavy enough that the strap dug into her shoulder like a knife. She was making her way toward the weighing station when her vision suddenly blurred. She had eaten only a handful of cornmeal that morning. Her ration had been reduced after another slave had stolen food and all the women's quarters had been punished collectively. The heat, the hunger, the exhaustion of years, it all converged in a single moment of weakness. Her foot caught on a furrow in the hard earth. She stumbled, and the sack slipped from her shoulder, spilling perhaps 20 pounds of cotton onto the ground, the white bowls rolling and mixing with dirt. Before she could even begin to gather it up, she heard the sound of hooves. Caldwell materialized as if he had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, his horse dancing sideways, kicking up dust. "You clumsy bitch!" he snarled, dismounting with a fluid motion that spoke of long practice. "You think cotton grows on trees? You think your time belongs to you, that you can waste it in mine?" Eliza dropped to her knees immediately, frantically gathering the scattered cotton, not looking up, not speaking. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained blank, empty, giving him nothing. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." She raised her eyes slowly, carefully, meeting his gaze for only a second before dropping them again. But that second was too long. Or perhaps not long enough, or perhaps there was nothing she could have done that would have satisfied him. The slap came without warning, a crack of sound that silenced the entire section of the field. Caldwell's hand connected with Eliza's face hard enough to knock her sideways, hard enough that she tasted blood from where her teeth cut the inside of her cheek. She landed on her hands in the dirt, cotton scattered around her like snow. "That's to remind you what you are," Caldwell said, his voice carrying across the field, a performance for everyone watching. "You're nothing. You exist because I allow it. You breathe because it profits us for you to breathe. Don't you ever forget that." Eliza remained on her hands and knees. She did not cry out. She did not touch her face, though it burned like fire. She simply stayed there, frozen, waiting for permission to move. But across the field, near the equipment shed where he had been repairing a plow blade, Isaiah had seen everything. His hands, which had been steady despite years of working with molten metal, began to shake. The hammer he held suddenly felt too light, too small. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to act, to cross that field and teach Caldwell what it meant to strike someone who couldn't strike back. But he had survived 15 years of enslavement by learning to calculate, to measure every action against its consequences. If he moved now, he would be killed. Worse, Eliza would be punished for causing the disturbance. So he stood there, watching as Caldwell remounted his horse and rode away, as Eliza slowly gathered herself and returned to picking cotton with a red mark blooming across her face like a brand. He stood there and felt something inside him that had been carefully contained for years begin to crack apart. That night, After the work bell rang and the slaves trudged back to their quarters for their evening rations, Isaiah found ways to position himself near Eliza. They stood in the food line, separated by 3 people, and did not speak, but when she reached for her portion of cornmeal mush, their hands brushed for the briefest instant, and in that touch was everything they could not say. "I saw. I'm sorry. I'm here. This cannot stand." Later, much later, when most of the quarters were asleep and only the crickets and the watchman's distant footsteps broke the silence, Isaiah slipped from the men's cabin. He knew the patrol routes, knew that the guard was lazy and often fell asleep near the equipment shed. He made his way through shadows to the edge of the women's quarters, where a gap in the boards allowed for whispered conversations. "Eliza," he breathed, his voice barely audible. She appeared at the gap after a moment, her face still swollen on one side. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered back. "I know. They'll kill you if you're caught. I know that too." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Eliza spoke, her voice so quiet he had to lean closer to hear. "I've been thinking about the river, about what's beyond it." Isaiah's breath caught. She was speaking of escape, a forbidden topic, a death sentence if overheard. "The patrols. I know every route they take. I've watched for 7 years. I know which dogs are kept where, which guards drink, which nights the master goes to town." Her voice remained calm, factual, but underneath he could hear something else, not quite hope, but perhaps the memory of what hope had once felt like. "Eliza, listen to me. Even if we could get past the patrols, past the dogs, past the river, there are slave catchers for hundreds of miles. There are bounties. There are people who make their living hunting people like us." "I know. Then why?" "Because I'm already dead, Isaiah. We all are. The question is whether we die as people or as property." Isaiah closed his eyes. He understood then what she was saying, what she had perhaps been planning longer than he knew. This wasn't about survival in the traditional sense. This was about reclaiming something that had been stolen. Autonomy, selfhood, the right to say no, even if saying no meant death. "There's another way," he said slowly. "What way?" "Caldwell. He has patterns too. Every night he makes rounds, then goes to his cabin near the stables. He drinks whiskey. He leaves his door unbarred because he thinks we're too afraid to touch him." Eliza was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was different, harder. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that there are different kinds of escape. I'm saying that every drop of blood he's spilled, every person he's broken, every child he's sold, there's a reckoning coming. Maybe it's supposed to come from us. They'll kill everyone. They'll make an example. I know. But Eliza, I can't watch him put his hands on you again. I can't. And if I can't, then what am I? What are we? We talk about being human, about remembering who we were before they put chains on us. But if we can't protect if we can't protect each other, then what's the difference between being alive and being dead?" Eliza pressed her forehead against the gap in the boards, so close he could feel her breath. "This is madness," she whispered. "Yes. We'll die." "Yes. Then why?" "Because 30 seconds of being human is worth more than 30 years of being property." She pulled back slightly, and he couldn't see her face in the darkness, but he felt her decision like a shift in the air between them. "Tomorrow night," she said. "He'll be checking the tobacco barn inventory. It's isolated. There's a path through the woods he takes back to his cabin." "How do you know this?" "I told you. I watch everything." Isaiah felt something loosen in his chest, some coil of tension that had been wound tight for 15 years. "I'll need a weapon, something from the forge." "No," Eliza said sharply. "No weapon, nothing that can be traced. If this happens, it has to look like an accident, a fall, a heart giving out, something that could be explained away, at least long enough for the confusion to give others a chance." "Others?" There are 12 people who've been planning to run for months. They're waiting for the right distraction, the right moment when the plantation is in chaos. If Caldwell dies mysteriously, if there's panic and confusion, if the master has to come from town and the other overseers are scrambling to maintain control, that's when they'll go. 12 people, Isaiah. 12 chances at freedom. Isaiah understood then that this was larger than him, larger than Eliza, larger than revenge for a single slap. This was about creating a moment of chaos in a system that depended on absolute control, about giving others a window of opportunity that might never come again. "You've been planning this," he said, not quite a question. "I've been planning something for 7 years. Today just made it clear what that something needed to be." They spoke for a few more minutes, working out details in whispers. Then Isaiah slipped back through the shadows to the men's quarters. He lay on his pallet, staring at the ceiling, his heart racing with fear and something else he had almost forgotten how to name: purpose. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Eliza picked cotton with the same mechanical efficiency as always, her face betraying nothing of the night's conversation. Isaiah worked the forge, the rhythm of hammer on anvil, a familiar meditation that helped keep his hands from shaking. Caldwell made his rounds on horseback, whip in hand, occasionally calling out corrections or threats, secure in his power, never imagining that among these silent, bowed figures were 2 people who had decided he would not see another sunrise. As evening approached, Isaiah watched Caldwell ride toward the tobacco barn, exactly as Eliza had predicted. The plantation kept its tobacco in a separate barn, about a quarter mile from the main complex, near the edge of the woods. It was Caldwell's job to monitor the curing process and keep inventory. He made this trip every Tuesday evening, usually taking about an hour before returning to his cabin. Isaiah waited until full dark, until the evening meal was finished and most of the slaves had retreated to their quarters. Then he moved. He knew the woods as well as anyone. He had been sent to cut timber often enough to know every path, every hollow, every place where the trees grew dense enough to hide a man. He positioned himself along the route Caldwell would take back from the tobacco barn, near a place where the path ran alongside a steep ravine filled with rocks and a shallow, fast-moving stream. He waited. The summer night was thick with humidity, with mosquitoes, with the sounds of frogs and night birds. His heart hammered so hard he was sure it could be heard for miles, but he remained still, breathing slowly, thinking of Eliza's swollen face, of Samuel and Grace torn from her arms, of 15 years of his own stolen life. Then he heard it, the sound of boots on the dirt path, the off-key humming of a man who had been drinking. Caldwell appeared, walking with the loose-limbed confidence of someone who had never had reason to fear these woods or the people who inhabited them. Isaiah stepped out from behind a large oak tree. Caldwell stopped, squinting in the darkness. "Who's that? Identify yourself." "It's Isaiah, sir, from the forge." "What the hell are you doing out here? You know the rules. No slaves outside quarters after dark without permission." "Yes, sir. I was looking for you, sir. There's a problem with the tobacco barn door. The hinge broke and—" "Why didn't you fix it earlier?" "I did, sir, but I used the wrong size pin and I'm afraid it'll fall again. I wanted to catch you before you wrote your report, sir, so there wouldn't be trouble." It was plausible enough. Slaves were often beaten for problems they couldn't control, and it wasn't unusual for one to try to head off trouble by reporting issues directly. Caldwell grunted, irritated but not suspicious. "Fine. Show me." Isaiah turned and started back toward the tobacco barn, Caldwell following behind him. As they walked, Isaiah's mind raced. He had imagined this moment, planned for it, but now that it was here, the reality of what he was about to do threatened to paralyze him. This was murder. Not self-defense, not an accident, but premeditated killing. In the eyes of the law, a slave killing an overseer was not just murder, but insurrection, a crime that would result not just in his own death, but in savage reprisals against every slave on the plantation. But then he remembered Eliza's words. 12 people. 12 chances at freedom. Before that, 30 seconds of being human is worth more than 30 years of being property. They reached a point on the path where it narrowed, running along the edge of the ravine. The ground here was treacherous, loose rocks and exposed roots making footing uncertain even in daylight. "Where's this broken hinge?" Caldwell demanded. Isaiah turned to face him. In the darkness, he could barely make out the overseer's features, but he could smell the whiskey on his breath, could see the outline of the whip still coiled at his belt. "There is no broken hinge," Isaiah said quietly. Caldwell went still. "What did you say?" "I said there's no broken hinge. I lied to get you out here." For a moment, confusion flickered across Caldwell's face. Then understanding, then rage. His hand went to the whip at his belt. "You stupid—" But Isaiah was already moving. 15 years of working a forge had given him strength and speed, and Caldwell, drunk and off balance on the uncertain path, was not ready. Isaiah didn't strike him. That would leave marks, evidence. Instead, he grabbed Caldwell's shoulders and pushed, using the man's own momentum against him. Caldwell stumbled backward, arms windmilling, trying to catch his balance. His boot came down on a loose rock that rolled under his weight. For one suspended moment, he teetered on the edge of the ravine, his eyes wide with sudden understanding of what was happening. Then he fell. The sound was terrible. The thud of a body hitting rocks, the crack of bone, a single abbreviated scream that cut off abruptly. Then silence, broken only by the rushing of the stream below. Isaiah stood at the edge of the ravine, breathing hard, staring down into the darkness where Caldwell had disappeared. His hands were shaking uncontrollably now, his entire body flooded with adrenaline and terror and something else. A wild, awful exhilaration. He had just killed a white man in the state of Mississippi as a slave. The magnitude of what he had done crashed over him like a wave. There was no going back now, no undoing this moment. Tomorrow, when Caldwell didn't appear, they would search. They would find his body. They would look for someone to blame. But Isaiah had one more thing to do before the storm broke. He made his way quickly back toward the slave quarters, moving through the woods like a shadow. He found the signal he and Eliza had arranged, a piece of white cloth tied to a specific tree branch near the women's quarters. Seeing it meant the deed was done, meant it was time for the 12 to make their run. He added his own marker, a stone placed just so, then retreated to the men's quarters, slipping inside and onto his pallet as if he had been there all evening. Around him, men snored and shifted in sleep, unaware that the world they knew was about to change forever. He did not sleep. He lay there in the darkness, listening to every sound, waiting for the alarm he knew must come. It came with the dawn. A shout from near the stables, then another, then the ringing of the emergency bell that meant all hands were to assemble immediately. Isaiah rose with the others, moving slowly, deliberately, showing nothing on his face. They gathered in the yard, men, women, children, everyone who lived and worked at Blackwood Plantation. The other overseer, a man named Briggs, stood on the porch of the main house, his face pale. "Mr. Caldwell has been found dead," he announced, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "He fell from the path near the tobacco barn, apparently on his way back from evening rounds. His neck is broken." A collective intake of breath moved through the assembled slaves, genuine shock mixed with something else, something that had to be carefully hidden. Relief. Caldwell had been a brutal man, and while his death would bring consequences, few would mourn him. "Until Mr. Blackwood arrives from town, you will all remain in the yard," Briggs continued. "No one moves, no one speaks. Anyone who tries to leave will be shot." The hours that followed were excruciating. The sun rose higher, turning the yard into a furnace. No food, no water, no shade. This was collective punishment, a reminder of who held power. Isaiah stood with the other men, his face blank, while inside his mind raced. Were the 12 already running? Had they made it past the patrols? Had the confusion worked as Eliza hoped? And where was Eliza? He scanned the crowd of women until he spotted her, standing near the back, her head bowed as always, unremarkable, invisible. But as he watched, she raised her eyes briefly and met his gaze across the crowded yard. In that look was everything: acknowledgement, gratitude, fear, resignation. Mr. Blackwood arrived from Natchez around midday, bringing with him the county sheriff and 2 slave catchers. He was a tall man, thin and gray, who prided himself on running an orderly plantation. Caldwell's death was not just a tragedy, but an embarrassment, a crack in the facade of control. "I don't believe it was an accident," Blackwood announced to the assembled slaves, his voice cold and carrying. "Mr. Caldwell knew those paths better than anyone. I believe he was murdered, and I believe someone here knows who did it." Silence. If the guilty party confesses now, only they will be punished. If I have to drag this information out, then everyone will suffer. Do I make myself clear? More silence, heavy as lead. Blackwood nodded to the sheriff, who stepped forward. "We're going to question you one by one. Anyone who refuses to cooperate will be considered an accomplice. Anyone who lies will be treated the same as the murderer." They started with the men, pulling them aside one by one for interrogation. Isaiah knew his turn was coming. He had prepared what he would say, how he would act, but he also knew that preparation meant little in the face of determined interrogation. When they called his name, he stepped forward calmly, his face a mask of deference. They took him to the equipment shed where Blackwood, the sheriff, and Briggs waited. "Where were you last night?" the sheriff demanded. "In my quarters, sir, after evening meal." "Anyone see you there?" "Yes, sir. There are 20 men who sleep in that cabin." "And you didn't leave? Not once?" "No, sir." The sheriff studied him, trying to read his face, looking for cracks in his composure. "You know what happens to slaves who kill white men?" "Yes, sir. Not just hanging, burning, sometimes worse. We make examples that last for generations." "Yes, sir." "You ever have any problems with Mr. Caldwell?" "No, sir." "Never got whipped by him? Never got angry?" "I've been whipped, sir, same as everyone. But I never held anger. Wouldn't do any good." It went on like this for an hour, the same questions rephrased different ways, looking for inconsistencies, for fear, for guilt. But Isaiah had lived as a slave for 15 years, had learned to school his face and voice into perfect submission, and he gave them nothing. Finally, they let him go and called for the next person. The interrogations continued all day and into the evening. The slaves remained in the yard, sweltering, exhausted, afraid. Children cried from thirst and were hushed by terrified mothers. Old people swayed on their feet. It was near sunset when one of the patrol riders came galloping into the yard, his horse lathered and blowing. "Mr. Blackwood, we found tracks heading toward the river. Looks like maybe a dozen people. Could be slaves making a run for it." Blackwood's face went white, then purple with rage. "When?" "Hard to say, sir, but the tracks are fresh. Last night or early this morning, most likely." The connection dawned on everyone at once. Caldwell's death hadn't been random. It had been a distraction, a deliberate act to create chaos, while others escaped. Blackwood turned to the assembled slaves, his voice shaking with fury. "Who planned this? Who organized this?" He strode into the crowd, grabbing people at random, shaking them. Tell me who did this." No one spoke. "Fine," Blackwood snarled. "Briggs, get the whips. If they won't talk, we'll beat it out of them. Start with the women. They always break first." It was then that Eliza stepped forward. She moved slowly, deliberately, every eye turning to watch her. She had never drawn attention to herself in 7 years at Blackwood, had never spoken above a whisper, had never done anything to make herself noticed. but now she walked through the crowd like she owned every inch of ground she crossed. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I can tell you what you want to know." The yard went silent. Isaiah's heart stopped in his chest. "Well," Blackwood demanded. Eliza looked at him directly, something slaves were never supposed to do, meeting his eyes with a level gaze that seemed to unnerve him. "I can tell you about Caldwell's death. I can tell you about the escape. I can tell you everything. But first, I want you to understand something. You're in no position to negotiate, girl." "I'm not negotiating. I'm simply telling you that what I'm about to say, you're going to listen to all of it. Because this isn't just about last night. This is about every night, every day, every year of brutality and theft and murder that you call business." Blackwood's hand moved toward his pistol, but the sheriff put a hand on his arm. "Let her talk. If she knows something, we need to hear it." Eliza nodded slowly. "Caldwell died because someone pushed him. Someone who'd watched him brutalize people for years. Someone who saw him hit a woman yesterday for the crime of being exhausted. Someone who decided that enough was enough." "Who?" Blackwood demanded. "Give me a name." "I'm getting to that. But first, you need to understand what you've created here. You think we're property. You think we don't remember, don't plan, don't have the capacity for anything beyond following orders. But every person here has a name, has a history, has people they loved who were sold away, has scars from whips, has children who were ripped from their arms because you needed money or wanted to punish someone or just because you could." She was speaking treason, speaking words that should have gotten her killed on the spot, but there was something in her voice, a terrible, quiet authority that held everyone frozen. "Those 12 people who ran? They've been planning for months. They studied your patrol routes, your guard schedules, your routines. They learned which guards drink, which dogs are loud, which paths through the woods are safest. They did all this while pretending to be what you wanted them to be, obedient, simple, controllable. And last night when Caldwell died, they saw their chance, and they took it." "Who pushed him?" the sheriff demanded. "Was it you?" Eliza smiled, a terrible, sad smile. "Does it matter? You'll punish someone regardless. You'll make your example. But here's what you don't understand. It doesn't matter who pushed him. What matters is that every single person here wished him dead. Every single person here has been carrying rage and grief for years, for lifetimes. You can whip us, hang us, burn us, but you can't kill what we carry inside. You can't kill memory. You can't kill hope." "Enough," Blackwood said, raising his pistol. "I asked you a question. Who killed Caldwell?" Eliza straightened her shoulders, and in that moment she looked regal, looked like anything but property. "I did," she said clearly. "I pushed him, I watched him fall, and I'd do it again." The words hung in the air like thunder. Isaiah moved without thinking, stepping forward. "She's lying. She's protecting me. I'm the one who killed him." "No," came another voice. One of the older men, a field hand named Jacob. "I did it, I confess." Then another voice, a woman named Sarah. "You're all wrong. It was me. It was me. Me. Me." The confessions rippled through the crowd like a wave. Slave after slave claiming responsibility, creating such a chaos of guilt that truth became impossible to determine. It was an act of collective defiance, unlike anything Blackwood Plantation had ever seen, and for one stunning moment, the power structure that had seemed so absolute trembled. Blackwood fired his pistol into the air, the sharp crack silencing the confessions. "Stop this! Stop this right now!" He turned to the sheriff. "Arrest them. Arrest all of them. We'll sort this out with proper interrogation." But before the sheriff could move, one of the patrol riders galloped back into the yard. "Mr. Blackwood, the runaways. They made it across the river. We tracked them to the far bank but lost the trail in the marshes. By the time we get dogs and more men organized, they'll be miles away." Blackwood's face contorted with rage and something else. Fear. The carefully maintained fiction of the happy, obedient slave, the myth that justified the entire system, had just been shattered in front of witnesses. Word of this would spread to other plantations, would inspire other acts of resistance, would crack the foundation of control that everything depended on. He needed to re-establish dominance immediately and absolutely. "Hang her," he said, pointing at Eliza. "And him," pointing at Isaiah. "And anyone else who confessed. I want every slave from 3 counties brought here tomorrow to watch. I want this lesson to last for generations." The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Blackwood, without a trial, without proper evidence, this is my property. These are my slaves. I can do with them as I please." "Actually," the sheriff said carefully, "murder is a criminal matter, not a property matter. I'll need to take the suspects to town, hold them for trial." "Fine. Trial tomorrow. Quick verdict. Quicker execution. But it happens. And it happens publicly." They took Eliza and Isaiah that night, chained them in the back of a wagon, and drove them to the county jail in town. They were separated, put in different cells, unable to speak to each other. Isaiah sat in the darkness, his hands chained to the wall, and thought about everything that had led to this moment. He thought about Philadelphia and freedom, about 15 years of stolen life, about Eliza's face when Caldwell struck her. He thought about the 12 who had escaped, about whether they had made it to freedom or been caught, about whether any of this had mattered. He discovered that he didn't regret it. Even knowing how it would end, he didn't regret it. In the cell down the hall, Eliza sat with her back against the cold stone wall and thought about Samuel and Grace. She wondered if they were still alive, if they remembered her, if Grace had grown into a woman or remained forever a child in her memory. She thought about 7 years of silence, about how speaking truth at the end had felt like finally exhaling after holding her breath for an eternity. She discovered that she felt lighter than she had in years. The trial, such as it was, took less than an hour. Both Eliza and Isaiah were found guilty of murder. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out immediately as an example to deter future insurrection. They were taken to Blackwood Plantation, where a gallows had been hastily erected in the yard. Slaves from surrounding plantations had been forced to attend. Hundreds of people gathered to witness the wages of resistance. As they stood on the platform, nooses around their necks, Blackwood addressed the crowd one final time. "Let this be a lesson. This is what happens to those who forget their place. This is what happens to murderers and runaways, and anyone who thinks they can challenge the natural order of things." Isaiah looked out at the sea of faces, at all the bowed heads and fearful eyes, and saw something else too. A glint of defiance here, a raised chin there, the subtle signs of people who had witnessed not just an execution, but an act of resistance. Eliza, standing beside him, turned her head slightly so she could see him one last time. Their eyes met, and everything they had never been allowed to say passed between them in that final look. The sheriff read the formal sentence. The trap door was prepared, but just before the lever was pulled, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. A rider came galloping up, carrying a telegram. He dismounted hastily and ran to the sheriff, pressing the paper into his hands. The sheriff read it, his face going pale. He turned to Blackwood. "It's from the governor's office. There's been a complaint filed. Questions about the legality of this trial. They're ordering a stay of execution pending review." "What? On whose authority?" "I don't know, sir. The telegram doesn't say, but I can't proceed with this execution, not without risking my position." Blackwood's face turned purple with rage, but he was trapped. He couldn't defy a direct order from the governor's office. Not without consequences, even he couldn't escape. Eliza and Isaiah were taken down from the gallows and returned to the jail to await further review. What neither they nor Blackwood knew was that one of the 12 escaped slaves, a man named Thomas who had once been trained as a clerk, had made it to a community of free black people in Illinois. There, he had told the story of what had happened at Blackwood Plantation to a group of abolitionists who in turn had made noise to contacts in the state government. The legal challenge was based on procedural technicalities, not on any recognition of the humanity of the accused, but it had bought time. Days turned into weeks. The legal wrangling continued. Stories about Blackwood Plantation began appearing in abolitionist newspapers in the North, turning Eliza and Isaiah into symbols of resistance, though they remained locked in jail, unaware of any of this. Then, 6 weeks after the failed execution, in the dark hours before dawn, the jail caught fire. In the chaos and confusion, several cells were opened, ostensibly to prevent the prisoners from burning alive. In the smoke and panic, 2 of those prisoners, a woman who never spoke and a blacksmith who had once been free, simply disappeared. Whether it was accident or design, whether abolitionists or sympathetic guards or simple providence played a role, no one could say for certain. But when the fire was extinguished and the jail secured, Eliza and Isaiah were gone. Searches were conducted, rewards posted, slave catchers deployed, but they found nothing. Some say the 2 made it north, finding freedom in Canada or hidden communities in the northern states. Some say they died in the attempt, buried in unmarked graves somewhere between slavery and freedom. Some say they joined communities of maroons in the swamps, living on the margins, always running, never truly free but never truly captured either. The truth is that no one knows. What is known is that 12 people escaped from Blackwood Plantation that night, and at least 8 of them made it to freedom. What is known is that the story of the quiet slave woman who spoke truth to power spread through the slave quarters of the South like wildfire, whispered in the darkness, remembered, passed down. What is known is that Mr. Caldwell, the overseer, who believed that slaves could be broken absolutely, didn't live to see morning after he slapped Eliza. And what is known is that silence, when finally broken, echoes for generations.